All right, good morning, everyone. We're all present, caffeinated, happy. I'm extremely honored and thrilled to be here with two of my extraordinary friends, colleagues, to discuss a topic that I think we all need to address. How do we create justice? I want to thank organizers at Aspen Ideas Festival for this opportunity. Graham Vesey, Kara Stein, Ava Hartman, Dan Porterfield, so many others who've made this possible. We often look to levers such as law and norms to address this question of how we handle the reckoning we're in American society today. This morning, I think we had the chance to do what's rarely done, to engage the power, historically and in a contemporary sense, of the arts for justice. Often this topic is addressed mainly through the venue of looking at the work of one artist or engaging with someone like me, an art historian or a cultural historian. And we now have a chance to do, I think, what Aspen Ideas Festival does best, which is to put people in conversation across disciplines and silos to engage with this topic. We will make this an interactive event. I'm going to warn you that you're also going to be part of the conversation. So get ready, around the 30-minute mark. But before we really kick things off, I'm going to act both as the moderator and as the discussant. I want to introduce my esteemed colleagues here. First, we have Neil Katyal, who you all likely know. He is the Paul and Patricia Sanders Professor of Law at Georgetown University and a partner at Milbank's Washington, D.C. office. This is just his brief bio, as you know. He was previously acting Solicitor General of the United States. He has argued 52 cases before the Supreme Court. Is that still accurate? And there might be one more I don't know about.
It's accurate.
Including defending the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. He is Vice President and Trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society and has received many honors, including the U.S. Justice Department, Edmund Randolph Award, which, as I understand it, is the highest honor given to a civilian. He's been rightly called a legendary litigator, and I'm honored to have him as a friend and colleague. Imani Perry. She is the Henry A. Morris Jr. and Elizabeth W. Morris Professor of Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality and African American Studies at Harvard. She's also the Carol K. Pforzheimer Professor at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute. Do you have the longest title? I think I have a long title too. She's the author of 9 books, and her latest is Black and Blues: How a Color Tells the Story of My People. Her books have received many awards. She was also named a MacArthur Fellow in 2023. She and I will be holding a book signing after the event, just to my right. And I'm honored to have her as a colleague at Harvard. They are both, in my mind's eye, thought partners as we engage with this topic that I'm writing about for a Random House book out next year. So to begin, I think I'll, instead of what we might have planned out, I'm going to actually begin with a question for you, Neil. As you think about the work of justice historically in the United States and today, how has your engagement with culture broadly defined, from photography to objects to monuments, transformed your notion of justice?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. And, one of the ways we actually became friends is that I have over my desk a picture of Frederick Douglass taken, a photograph, a daguerreotype. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, indeed.
And it just shows him in his elegance, but his grittiness. And it's what I always look to every day as I'm doing my work. I'm a litigator. I don't know that much about art. I know a little bit about it. And recently have joined the Whitney Museum with Lori and others, the board, because I do believe that art is fundamentally connected to justice, and American art in particular. And you can see that if you think about abolition and you think about the spirituals, like songs like Go Down Moses, which were capturing a certain view of equality, or the one that really moves me, Langston Hughes's 1926 poem, I Too, well before Brown versus Board of Education, well before it. I too sing America, he says. And it's such a rejoinder to the idea that the phrase we the people doesn't include African Americans. And it has tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. And, that invocation of tomorrow, the sense of inevitability, picking up on what Dr. King will later pick up on that with the arc of justice and the like. So this is well before Brown versus Board of Education, but he's talking about these fundamental guarantees, which I do think ultimately change the litigation landscape as well. I mean, Charles Houston, Thurgood Marshall, they're all inspired by in reacting to this work. Nina Simone's, after the Birmingham bombings in 1964 and the assassination of Medgar Evers, it has the song Mississippi Goddam, which is all about this. And so, time and again, we've seen art do this and perform this role. And one of the things I hope we talk about is, I think, my view that art needs to do more of that right now when we have an unprecedented threat to the rule of law. And people like Donald Trump have allowed the gap, the lack of celebration about America and what it stands for. They've exploited it. And so he can say things like, who cares about the Constitution? Because we've lost that as part of our popular discourse in the arts.
It's such a stunning framework you just offered at the end, because you're allowing us, I think, to set out some tenets about what art does for democracy and for imagining the United States anew. Frederick Douglass is really the headwaters of this idea. As you have in your office this reminder, I want to ensure the audience knows too about why that's so important. He gives a speech during the Civil War in 1861, and he redrafts it many times about something no one would have expected at the time. And he made the case, and the title of the speech was Pictures and Progress, that images would have as much efficacy for ensuring equality as laws and norms. And the reporting on the speeches is fascinating because people were silent, apparently. They really were stunned. But there was a bravery in that declaration. It's a new technology at the time. But he understood there was going to be a way that we needed to move past our blind spots regarding how we see each other. He goes on to become the most photographed American man, right, in the 19th century. I mean, so you have one of the large set of those images. Why? Why did he believe in the power of the image so much? And so we're here in the headwaters of that idea, because he says at the end of his speech, it might take over 150 years for us to consider and reconsider this idea. It was a humble statement. He didn't believe that he had fully laid out the why of how art can inspire justice, and hope that others would come along and do so. So I feel as if I'm speaking with those who he had in mind. Imani, are there ways in which you, over the course of your career, have come to reconsider and consider the notion of culture for justice anew?
Sure. So I'll say I began my career as a law professor. I was a legal historian and thought and wrote a good deal about Douglass in that context. And I want to just sort of think about culture and the arts, particularly in terms of literary and sonic musical culture, which I think Douglass is extraordinary because he thinks about the panoply, right? And so if we think about sort of in the immediate post-bellum period, there's this promise of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Amendments. There's a sense of possibility and this guarantee of full citizenship. And then in relatively short order, there's a betrayal that in essence, the reconciliation of the regions of the country happens at the expense of a robust interpretation of rights for African Americans. And there's this narrow and at times tortured interpretation over the course of several generations of the 14th Amendment, such that it consistently winds up not protecting the rights of African Americans. So what I'm interested in is a tradition, and it's an artistic tradition, and it's also a philosophical tradition, it's an argumentative tradition on the part of African Americans who are operating in multiple arenas that is an argument for a different kind of jurisprudence. And that happens in part in artistic form. So if we think about Douglas's arguments, whether we're talking about the speech in 61 or 1852, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and the kind of antebellum period, where he's arguing for a reinterpretation of the Constitution, such in a form that actually is not embraced by most abolitionists at the time. And then that, the theorist who helps me think about, it's the beginning of a tradition. And the theorist who most helps me think about that tradition is actually the philosopher Stanley Cavell, and this concept of the passionate utterance. And Cavell is drawing a distinction from sort of philosophy of language where they talk about the performative utterance, which is this sort of idea that there are certain things that you say that automatically become sort of an assertion of a legal right. So it's sort of like, you know, when you get married, once you say, I do thee wed, right, you're married. So that has a kind of perlocutionary force. Cavell talks about passionate utterances as these kinds of statements that are, as he describes them, invitations into the disorders of desire. It's not clear that what they put forward will actually be embraced, but it is an argument for a different kind of set of civic and social relations. And this is what Douglas does repeatedly. We see it in someone like Martin Luther King Jr., Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And the Black oratorical tradition is an artistic tradition where he's drawing in that speech on, he engages the Constitution, but also natural law and also theology, and really hinges his argument in that case on the Augustinian precept of that which is not just is not law. That wasn't technically true at the time, but it becomes an invitation to a different kind of social relation. We see it when Fannie Lou Hamer is speaking at the Mississippi Democratic Party convention, and they have engaged, people in the South have engaged in a freedom vote, which is not legally recognized, but it is an invitation to a different kind of social relation. And in both instances, the power of the art of oratory actually is an engagement, it's an appeal, but it's also an assertion of what I would think of as a kind of alternative jurisprudence that has existed in Black thought of the course of several hundred years. In a more kind of explicitly artistic way, a song like Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is known as the Black National Anthem, is actually composed with this vision of an alternative social and political order that is both an appeal to the larger society, but also an assertion from within that is saying like that which is currently law is not just, but we ought to have a sense of social and civic responsibility, conception of citizenship that is distinct from that which has been afforded. So all of that is a kind of a long way of saying I think that one of the things that is important to do is actually trace a tradition of expressive culture that has consistently afforded a conception of justice that has been that was denied, long denied, and that in many ways continues to be thwarted, right? And so there's this sort of multi-generational transfer of a conception of justice that upon which those who have been historically excluded rely upon to make arguments externally, but also to remind themselves that they ought to be beneficiaries of a just society, even when that feels elusive.
Beautiful. One of the many things that I think culture has done historically to establish justice is claimed the ground, claimed the narrative of who counts and who belongs in the United States before law would. It also transforms us from observers into agents, oftentimes, as we engage with a work of art. And I think, finally, it has offered a means of contestation and critique in the absence of a legal arena at times. And so, Neil, I wonder if, as you think about your practice, how you engage with the work of culture, even as a precondition for law. And here I'm thinking about historic examples, abolition, for example. This passionate utterance, as Cavell might call it, came there with this declaration through this Josiah Wedgwood cameo that was distributed through the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, in 1787. There you have that kneeling, supplicant, enslaved man on that jasper ware white cameo, and encircling him is that statement, am I not a man and a brother? Right? Before the 14th Amendment would come along. So I wonder, in contemporary sense or historic sense, how you think about your colleagues alongside you, the artist, the activist.
I think my answer will reveal very clearly that I am not the genius that other people on this panel are. I think about it very practically. And I think art has two ways in which it matters to the work I do trying to further justice. One is art in shifting the Overton window of what is possible, what is believable. And sometimes that's done very directly, as Amani was saying, with the references to her works of art, the references she drew to works of art. I think about Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 does probably more to ignite the abolitionist movement, and Lincoln, when he meets her, says something like, "Oh, you're the little lady who started the Civil War," or something like that. Maybe apocryphal, but that's the idea in which that piece, that art really did change people's beliefs. More practically, I'm reminded, because it was the 10-year anniversary of the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court on Friday. This is something I and many others spent years working on for marriage equality, but it couldn't have happened just with legal arguments. There was a whole move to get Hollywood to depict same-sex couples as ordinary, normal people who belonged at the table. And that is what I think ultimately shifted what was possible at the Supreme Court. So there's a way in which both direct appeals to art, abolitionist art or whatever, can do this, but also just subtle messaging that is sent through art, which isn't quite as hit you over the head. The other way in which art, I think, impacts what we do is artists as collective memory. And we can talk more about this, the specific examples, but I do think that one way, and even the photographs that Douglas is talking about, is about depicting certain things that are happening, and those become uncontestable just because you have an actual photographic image of what it is.
That's right. That's right. We might want to engage with, this might be a good time to go right to one thing I haven't said at the start. This panel in part was prompted by an exchange that I found profound, because he is a genius despite the fact that he's claiming he's not, around an event. I think that centralized for all of us the power of a video, the power of an image. Among the many sort of accolades and important work that Neil Katyal's done for all of us is been the special prosecutor in the state of Minnesota for the case for the murder of George Floyd. And thinking through the impact of that video and how it was different from, say, a video of the beating of Rodney King, and how that trial utilized it to insist that he brought this on himself, it is something that in our exchange stayed with me, allowed me to see this work anew, and it's bringing us together now. So I wonder if you could speak to us about tactics and impact of that video as you thought about your strategy for the case.
Yeah, so Darnella Frazier, who took the video, she's a 17-year-old girl walking down the street with her niece, who's 9 years old, on May 25th, and sees this, and she pulls her camera out. She's not seeking to be some famous person or an artist or anything like that. She's just taking her camera out and recording this. And I'm sure almost everyone in this room has seen the video once or twice. For those of us on the prosecution team, we saw it hundreds of times, which was not nearly as big of a deal as when I think about what the George Floyd family, who were incredible people, had to endure watching that video every single day of the trial for 40 days. The strength and resilience they had is I'll never forget it. But the video itself, I think, was crucial. It was crucial in getting the state to first move on the prosecution, because otherwise there would have been all sorts of denials. He brought it on himself. He was taking drugs. He was aggressive. He had a counterfeit $20 bill and was violent and so on. The video showed all of that to just be bollocks. And it's this work that is, many minutes long. It's continuous. It's not edited in any way. And so it creates this true sense of you're there and you feel it when you watch the video, the sense of authenticity. I do think had the video not been there, it might have been hard to just even have the prosecution in the first place, let alone convince a jury of 12 people. Because you got to run the table as a prosecutor. You got to win all 12 in order to get a conviction of here Derek Chauvin. But all 12 were ultimately convinced and convinced quickly. And I do think it's because of the video. There's no way, I think, to see that video and think that the defense explanations held up. And so it was a moment of truth. I was so pleased to see that the Pulitzer Committee, awarded her a special award for it. Again, she's not seeking any of this. She's a 17-year-old girl. And so there are, I think, deep questions, like works of art generally are supposed to be intentional, supposed to have a certain message. There's composition and planning and forethought ahead of time. There's none of that here. She's an unwitting artist, but an artist who, to me, embodies what I talk about as art is capturing collective memory. I mean, without her, there's no way in which our memory would be what it is of that day.
Great example, yeah. Yeah, I love that example. There's a poem, and I wish I could remember the name of it, by Reginald Wayne Betts, who's an attorney and also a poet and a formerly incarcerated person, where he talks about the distinction between the saints and the witnesses, and he says the saints are the ones who have to die and the witnesses are the ones who remain to tell the story. And there's a way in which that moment in art, what are artists but witnesses, right? And ethical witnesses, we hope. And that is a context in which there's this extraordinary witnessing that takes place. But I also have to say, one of the things that I find sort of profoundly heartbreaking in the current moment is that video and that judicial process led to millions of people being in the streets all over the world, and that there is effectively no transformation after that fact. We don't see a transformation in American policing in any significant way. And so I try to think about, well, what's the distinction between that moment and the visual imagery of the hoses knocking down children in Birmingham, Alabama, in my birthplace, right? Or the theater, and theater is a kind of performance, and I don't mean that in a diminishing way, but of marches, right? It also had this impact upon people, viewers, who became witnesses. They were enlisted as witnesses to injustice. And I think perhaps the major difference is that there was a kind of infrastructure of organizing underneath those moments that actually served to shape the interpretations that we were going to have and actually put pressure on the society as such. And so the question for me is, my gut question is always like, how do we do that again? How do we sort of harness the power of culture and the arts, but match it with a kind of organizing that will actually allow them to be as transformative as they should be?
I think that's really profound, and I think there's a way in yes, you can look at right now and think, have we learned nothing from May 25th, 2020? It looks like retrenchment, and particularly with this administration and some of the policies it's announcing. But I do think we're just 5 years in, and one of the virtues of having a video like Darnella Fraser's video is, none of us could be in the court, many of us couldn't be in the courtroom, but 10, 20 years from now, 5 years from now, 2 years from now, that video remains. And so there's witness to what happened on that day that nobody can take away. And yes, there may be a blip of retrenchment right now, but that art helps bend that arc of justice because it allows us to see what actually happened.
Absolutely. In addition, I want to bring another set of colleagues, other lawyers, into this conversation. And as we think about this, one way to register the impact of the video is to look at the structure and tactic and strategy of erasure and censorship that came in its wake. I I mean, erasure and censorship has long been a part of how we have distorted the narrative of who counts and who belongs in society. But once that video emerged, the level of empathy that it generated, in part accelerated by the stillness brought about through the pandemic, which allowed us all to have a collective arena, and with probably for the first time in decades, to look at one thing together. Once that took place, once you could see the efficacy of this object, of this video, the equation that art plus empathy equals justice that Darren Walker has sort of used, and I think it's a great framework, was clear to many, was true. And so it became clear as well to many that these types of images and videos really shouldn't be seen. Right? And that's when you see the beginning of this curricular reform movement. So in fact, there are ways to look through negation and subtraction at the impact of the video.
I think that's such a beautiful point. And to take this sort of to put the sort of pushback against my sort of devastation and desperation in the moment, it makes me think of examples like, and we talked about Wedgwood, and I think in contrast, and examples like someone like Thomas Komarov, who is this black potter who is not who's recognized as this incredibly important historic potter, but who isn't recognized as black until relatively recently, and he put his name, the signature on all of the pots that he created, right? In this effort to sort of assert himself, even though it becomes a submerged history, or the way in which enslaved people planted periwinkle flowers where their dead were buried when they didn't have headstones, right? And that now archaeologists are seeking, and they look at underneath where the periwinkle are in the Upper South, and they can find evidence of those before. So I do think there is both this long tradition of erasure, but yes, when the record remains, even if it's submerged, there's some sense of possibility there.
One thing is the non-lawyer on the panel, I've noticed, and I should say I'm a professor at Harvard, and I teach about this intersection, race, culture, and justice, that I've noticed is how many preeminent lawyers, your colleagues, have looked to the arts lately and transformed their organizations to centralize the arts for the work of justice. Brian Stevenson creating the landmark National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is the first memorial to document and to honor the over 4,000 black men, women, and children who were killed due to lynching, racial terror in the United States, in Montgomery, Alabama. Why would a lawyer take this time to create a monument? We know he's busy, right? Why would Sherilyn Ifill create the 14th Amendment Center, thinking through the second founding of the United States as done through the creation of this document that instantiates equality for the first time in the Constitution, and ensure that the work of art is essential for the 14th Amendment Center's work? Do you see a transformation in thinking around this idea?
I think it's always been there. I think, you can't actually, the law is not particularly good at creating social change. It's a very conservative Burkean institution. If you want social change, yes, you can try and quote the words of the Constitution or something like that in court, but without some social movement behind it, it's really difficult. And art is a way of short-circuiting our logic and getting us to a point in which we can experience a different reality. And so that's why I think you see people like Brian Stevenson doing this. For me, like as I see the Supreme Court getting more and more out of step with American society, I've thought to myself, I have to also be in a different forum. So I'm actually writing a television show about the Supreme Court. It's kind of West Wing for the Supreme Court.
Awesome.
I'm writing it with John Mulaney, and it'll be out in a couple of years. But part of the idea is to try and use the arts to spur a conversation about what justice is.
I'm glad you mentioned this. I'd heard about this, and I thought if at any point in the conversation Neil makes the case, because we thought at first this might be debate, that law matters more than the arts, I thought I was going to bring up the fact that he's writing the show. So congratulations, I'm excited to see this. Imani, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, You know, what it makes me think about, and this is what a lot of my early work in legal history was about, is, you know, the late 19th century, when in the period we think of as a kind of redemption, when African Americans are excluded from full participation in society. There is this sort of blossoming of literature that is, you know, which I refer to as argumentative realist literature, where people actually take the case for racial justice, for a different kind of interpretation of the Constitution, to the work of fiction. And they are delivering these kind of extensive jurisprudential arguments in fiction, and not just in terms of constitutional law, but also private law is this really important area where they're talking about, they're exposing the failures of the way contract law is interpreted and property law is interpreted. So I do think, and these are people like, you know, Charles Chestnut, who was trained as an attorney, right? And later James Weldon Johnson, who's also trained as an attorney, right? So in some ways excluded from the path that they wanted to seek in the, or that they hoped to, you know, achieve in the courts, they take it to fiction with the hope that the fiction will move people. So I think it's an incredibly, it has a long tradition, and it's an important move, in part because, you know, everything hinges on interpretation, right? So you have this legal principle, you have this rule, and then the question is, okay, well, what sense do we make of it? And that is subject to the way we tell stories.
I mean, one of the tenets that it feels as if we're developing as we're talking is that whenever there's a moment of crisis where you can see the tension between what is true and what is just, culture steps into the breach. Or should, as Neil, you're arguing or asking about the current moment. In one conversation I had here earlier, someone asked where our song that would be emblematic of this era and moment was, and actually tasked our president of Juilliard, who's here, I believe Damien Wotzel, to find the person who will create it. What do we do in these moments when we have that tension between what's true and what's just? The period of redemption before we have the 14th Amendment is or after we do, is one such moment. But I wonder if that rings true for you, that idea of that tension.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and just to talk about song, I mean, I think, to go back to something that you write about so beautifully about the grounds, right, is, and, you know, when we think about the civil rights movement, we think about people laying claim to the ground and actually making space in the sonic arena with freedom songs, right? So they're both moving through space, physical space, laying claim to the ground, which they are not seen as sort of part of the collective ownership of, but also expanding it further with the power of voice and the message behind the power of voice. So yes. Absolutely.
I do want to salute so many of the artists that are doing this work. One of the ways that I entered this topic was by thinking through the term stand your ground law. And is it still in 33 states approximately, some version of this, stand your ground law?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but it's a majority.
Yeah. And it's the law that entitles you to stand your own ground in the condition of a threat, but it has disproportionate impact for Black and brown, you know, individuals in the United States. Many artists, from Mark Bradford to Theaster Gates to Kehinde Wiley, have taken the idea of ground literally. What do we mean by ground? Is it just what's beneath us, or is it also the ground as in the narrative of who counts and who belongs? In the arts, the ground is something you always have to deal with because it's the term we use for the visual representational plane. When you're painting, you're dealing with the ground of the canvas. So there's this kind of triadic way that the ground comes into artistic practice. And taken together, you see them also engaging with stand your ground law, critiquing it. Brian Stevenson's EJI Memorial is a great example. The ground as you're walking through and the suspended plinths emblematizing the lynching event and also the individuals who were lynched drops beneath you. The ground falls beneath you. And then you see the groundlessness of the cases themselves. But the term ground is also used in legal context to mean reason. You know, it's a euphemism for reason. This case is groundless. So this is one way that I think many of the artists in this room are engaging with the idea, Tyler Mitchell being also foremost among them. I spoke with him yesterday, and his work engages with the groundlessness of law and its legacy and its aftermath in the wake of Emmett Till, for example, and some of his works. So we have alongside us artists who are doing this spade work, and I think, Neil, you're calling for more and more organizational force, as Imani, you pointed to, around it. I think at this point we wanted to start to engage the audience both in Q&A, but first with a bit of an exercise that I think we'll have fun with. Everyone here is pretty much paired with someone to their left or their right, and we wanted to see if you might take a few minutes to think about an object, an image, a photograph, a monument that's changed your notion of who counts and who belongs in the United States, changed your notion of justice. And if you will speak about that for a few minutes, we're going to come back to you and see if Eddie Brave Soul wants to share what they discussed, and then we're going to open up for some Q&A. Does that sound all right? Are you willing? You're game? Okay. If anyone's not paired, I'm going to come and do it with them. We'll give us a break. Oh, there's Lonnie. Lonnie. Lonnie Bunch. You don't have someone. You two want to go together? You want to do it together?
Are you having fun?
Yeah, I mean, I've never written fiction before.
Working on that now? Yeah, it's hard. It's different.
Yeah.
But that's sort of what's exciting. Or like
It is kind of fun. Like, I mean, when I'm really in it, I actually like if I'm sitting down at
I wanted
dinner,
to make sure
I
everyone
almost
was
can
paired
feel
up
the
over here.
characters
All right.
there. Like,
yeah,
it's really cool.
perfect.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really like, oh, what would she think about this or that? And
Is this
like,
all right
yeah,
so far?
it's super interesting.
Are you basing it on real cases, or is it all speculative, or a combination?
Both, yeah, it's a combination. There's some real cases that have happened, some that I know robots and AI, things like that, and polygamy,
Oh yeah.
yeah. So,
And
then
I'll
it's
open up in a minute.
modeled. It's
We have microphones. Is there anything I didn't hit on that you wanted me to ask? Everything is
perfect. Thank you. Is this your
Okay, good. All right, I hate to break it up. I can feel the energy in the room. We want to share it with you. Okay, all right, we're going to bring it to a close in a few seconds here. I love that they don't want to stop talking about this. All right. All right. So we're going to get to questions in just a minute. If we might have 2 or 3 who want to volunteer what they discussed, we would love to hear. Here. Yes. Oh, okay. I feel like a privilege this side. We'll do a few more if we can be brief, because we only have about 10 minutes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so Jillian and I spoke about the Statue of Liberty, actually, saying what is it, I just had a cousin visiting. I've been here 40 years, but I had a cousin visiting me from India last week. And this was our second time to the US, and I took her around to the Statue of Liberty. She had tears in her eyes, you know. And I just want this moment to not rob us of the knowledge that we are living in one of the most free, one of the most welcoming, most generous nations on the planet.
Yeah.
I don't want us to forget that ever. And I think the Statue of Liberty just reminds us over and over again.
That's right. And it's, yes.
Well, yeah, Voldemort, and Jillian just mentioned with you, notwithstanding Voldemort running the country right now. So.
And we should also mention the Statue of Liberty was initially designed to commemorate emancipation. So there are broken shackles under the feet, right, of Lady Liberty herself. Excellent. The next was there, yeah?
So for me, it's the recent No King's March. And one of the things I've really noticed is a lot of the marchers, put a lot of care in the creation of their signs. And I had gone to my friend's house where we were gathering to make signs. They had brought all these art supplies. And a lot of attention went into these signs.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I thought that was so amazing, to talk about standing your ground, where I marched, there might have only been a handful of people of color, and there were thousands of white people there marching. And the thing that just touched my heart were the garbage truck drivers driving by and honking, the landscape artists driving by and honking, the fire engines driving by and honking. They were all people of color who were driving, the workers basically, who were driving by and honking and basically saying thank you, because they were too afraid to be on that street marching because they didn't know if ICE would show up. So for them to drive by and honk and do a couple trips around was their statement of thank you, because we can't stand our ground right now, and the only safe ground we have right now is in this truck that we're driving, that we can haul ass away if we need to. But those signs, the signs that people create, are such beautiful works of art.
Yeah. Passionate utterance as sonic in other ways. Here, Lori. I think Lori was. Could we bring the mic to Lori, Tish? Yeah, thank you. And Larry, yeah.
Thank you. So, Sarah, you've been in my apartment. I think Neil has too. And I have the great privilege of living with a lot of American modernism.
Yes.
And people always come in and they say, which is your favorite painting? Which is your favorite painting? And, there are big paintings and small paintings, but I always point to the Jacob Lawrence. I don't know if you remember that, Sarah.
I do.
Called Victory.
I do.
And it's not the most prominent painting, but it is my favorite. It was part of the war series. Was that after World War II, I think? Yeah. And Jacob Lawrence was in a segregated battalion, I guess.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it's called Victory, so you think it should be, stars exploding and happiness, but instead he's sitting, the soldier that's painted is sitting kind of hunched over. You don't see his face, but he's hunched over, and you see sadness. And, it's definitely a Pyrrhic victory. And every time I see it, it's just, it's about war. It's about war, it's about segregation, and it's so meaningful to me. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you, Lori, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership, really, too. It's so necessary. We have many others. I think we'll maybe have time for two more. We'll do two on the left here and come back to Tyler, yeah. Or is there another mic that you can bring to the front? Yeah.
I think I'll just speak on behalf of this group.
Great.
My name is Farida. I'm from Kenya, Africa. And when we were having this conversation, a symbol we all talked about was the passport. As somebody who has been traveling to America in and out as an education activist, I've always felt like it's the color of your passport and what kind of passport do you hold matters a lot. I was sharing my experience when I was coming to Aspen, where I had already boarded a plane, where I was the only black person, and then security comes, and like we're doing a random security check. I'm like, how random is that you're walking straight to me as a black person accessing the US? And this is something that I'm expecting the immigration to deal with. You are the embassy that given me the visa to access your country. And looking at that in terms of even the kind of treatment we get, not only in this city, but as a black person traveling from a different country to the America, your passport determines what kind of treatment you get and what kind of value you add when participating in different things. For me, that really matters a lot. And my friend here shared about what airports as a symbol means too. That's the place where people usually either get disconnected from their people as immigrants, as refugees, or even a symbol or a center place where people get to connect. Some of us lost or disconnected with their parents at the airport. And sometimes you walk to the airport and see people now connecting with their family, which is a great symbol. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We're short on time. Thank you so for sharing this. We have one more from the other side, and then we'll end here.
Thank you for the exercise, Fidel Vargas with HSF. My brilliant colleague next to me mentioned the Vietnam War Memorial, which makes permanent the sacrifice of peoples from all races, all ethnicities, mostly on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, and just how that is going to persist. And for me, it's the Lincoln Memorial. And every time I go to Washington, D.C., I climb up the steps. And I imagine that Lincoln didn't imagine me being born in the U.S. from parents who were permanent residents in California, thinking about someone like me. Yet, he and those that wrote the 14th Amendment had the foresight, right, to say persons, any person born in the United States as a U.S. citizen. And so I don't know how much more clearer they could have been to ensure. So those were the two things.
Yeah, thank you. One final.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to share a work or a series of artworks by a friend of mine, the sculptor Hugh Hayden, who I felt really deals very adeptly with this idea of who belongs and who's able to belong or allowed to belong, especially in the United States. He did an exhibition in 2018 that everyone should go look up called Border States, which was a series of woodworks. He works primarily in wood, mainly depicting picket fences, but also traditional American family dining tables and dining sets, where he's carved dangerous points, sharp points emerging from the picket fences and the dining tables. Sometimes they look like shark fins, sometimes they emerge from the objects to where you can't approach or get any closer, even though you want to. I think of the picket fence as this symbol that's been largely evoked through the canon of photography and art as a symbol that's meant to keep some in and others out, right? And I see it as this symbol that's, for me at least, growing up in the South, come to be often a dangerous one when you think about the way it signals to not cross a certain boundary onto someone's yard even, right? And thinking about your example of stand your ground law, the idea that you could accidentally stumble into someone's property line and fairly be killed, assaulted, attacked, is what I think those works really powerfully evoke. So I would recommend everyone check out the work of Hugh Hayden. He's a brilliant sculptor, and I think it speaks to all of your points about art, meeting the moment and really evoking these ideas of belonging.
Thank you. We're creating the syllabus for the seminar you didn't know you were a part of when you walked in here, and he's being humble, modest. You should also see his work in relation to this. We have time maybe for one question or share. I can't tell which is which with the hands, but I think we had one question from the far side of the tent at the very start. And if we could bring a mic to her, that would be great. I think she's standing now, right there. Is there anyone with the mic? Oh. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Deborah Rappaport. I live in Minneapolis. I'm a rabbi. And my question lifts from where you, what you talked about, how art influences the possible. Art influences where we might go. And my question is about the proliferation of dystopian literature right now and the proliferation of horror movies and things that are like and end of times movies and books and literature, and noticing myself the impact when I ask younger people for aspirations. There's a deep despair that I attribute to an immersion in that kind of cultural messaging. And so I'm curious if you have any response to that and how to respond to that.
It's interesting
why people are drawn to it.
Because I actually think of that, the much of that work in the opposite way. I think I view it as a warning shot. Don't go and adopt this dystopian society. Think of The Handmaid's Tale as a perfect illustration of that, but we could go back to Brave New World or other things. I mean, we've had dystopian literature as part of our canon for a long time, but most of it seems to me to be a warning shot.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think they're sort of like, they're almost like neo-Jeremiads, like from the Protestant puritanical pastors have said, if we are not careful, we're going to go down this dangerous course. And what's interesting is that in some of the literature, what you find is these seeds of different kinds of sociality or different kinds of possibility of connection in the midst of the apocalypse. And that, I think, is supposed to be where the sense of possibility resides.
And it feels profound to me to end on this note, because if there's any moment in which you could have found reason for abject despair, it would have been in 1861 when Frederick Douglass is standing speaking about the power of images, and instead he leans into this and so believes in this new medium and a new way to expand the arsenal for justice, that he is creating this body of images of himself, and one arrives on the desk of Neil Katyal, over 150 years later, inspiring the work to continue forward, and has populated your brilliant mind and body of work, Imani. So I find that as I look to the arts, it's also to remain hopeful and to find reasons why I must. So it feels as if it's just an appropriate note to end on. But do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share? Or
I can't beat that.
Right, perfect conclusion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Neil and Imani.